Propaganda seems to have always played a very large part in any war we wage, and also for support in our army in general. You can't watch TV without seeing an Army Strong commercial. Pandora has an ad for the Navy, and even in schools there's active recruiting. Have you ever wondered where all this started? Well, the answer to that would be World War I, or as they referred to it in their time as the Great War. But its process of creation didn't start off as smoothly as you might think, especially for Germany. As you see, during the time up to the war, propaganda wasn't used very much. But as the war progressed, the death toll stacked up, and we found ourselves in a very large need to keep the soldiers and civilians' morale up. Even with that need, these forms of propaganda were just a means to keep everyone feel safe in the face of hunger, strife, or death. After the war, when Germany had lost and was humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, the propaganda turned dark and wicked. Instead of reassuring the citizens, it seemed that the government was trying to intimidate them. But why did this turn so dark? What made the German government feel like they had to scare their people to be submissive? We have gathered a few people here that might help us gain some insight into what had happened during this time by telling us about their own experiences. Now the first people joining us today are going to be Tyler Johnson, who was a soldier on the front lines and has personal experience with these newspapers that were provided by the German government, and his wife, Paige Johnson, who had two young ones to look after at home. Thank you, too, for joining us today. Mr. Johnson, I would just like everyone to hear from you. How is life in the trenches?
Thanks for having us. You know, I've been asked this question a lot of times in my life. The answer is life in the trenches was pretty much the same for everyone in it. The rations were severely lacking, disease was spreading, and many of men lost it. They couldn't handle the constant bombing and the fear we had to live with every day, because that's what living in the trenches was like, living in fear.
So with all of the fear that you're talking about, what helped you carry on?
The first reason is the same for every married military man, to come home to my family, to live in peace with them once this was all over. The other reason was the newspapers that were provided for us. These newspapers filled themselves with tales of German victories and how German victory was right around the corner. Even though we knew it wasn't completely true, it gave us hope, you know. It made us feel like our sacrifice and lives had a positive cause for this war. It kept the whole army's morale up and helped us keep fighting. We held on to those articles.
I agree that keeping the Army's morale up is very important indeed. But Miss Johnson, I was wondering, how was life without your husband around?
I prayed every day that my husband returned to me, but I was also so busy with trying to feed our children that I didn't have much time to worry about anything else. Food was so scarce that I was afraid every day that we would all starve to death. It is the most heartbreaking thing to see our children sick every day without being able to help them.
That is terrible, Miss Johnson, but I was wondering, were all of these forms of propaganda helpful during this time?
Of course, like my husband said earlier, that it made us feel like it would all be worth it in the end, that this war would come to an end in the near future and all of our troubles along with it. Also, if the government hadn't done all of this, I believe that the war effort would have fallen through and the war would have been lost a lot earlier along with it.
That's really interesting. You're saying that if the German government hadn't kept up with propaganda, that the war would have been lost that much sooner?
Who would have kept fighting had they known how bad the German army was actually off? More and more soldiers would have given in to their fear if they had known that their sacrifice was in vain.
What about after the war's end, when everything propaganda seemed to turn sour?
Well, I was just glad to have made it back, but it seemed like even though the war was over on the fronts, it wasn't over at home. Even after the war, the economy plummeted due to the debts that Germany had owed everyone. Along with all those debts, all those wounded soldiers needed to be taken care of and couldn't work. Widows of those who have fallen had to find ways to provide for their families. It seemed like everyday life was getting worse and worse. So naturally, the government was afraid of the revolution and the Bolsheviks trying to take the power. So their response was to try and intimidate us away from revolting through propaganda. Posters of people smiling and saying, "Join the cause," were replaced with posters filled with dark images about anarchists killing honest German people, or posters about the Bolsheviks leading the German country into chaos.
So the reason the government's propaganda turned so dark was due to this fear?
Yeah.
Well, thank you both very much. That was extremely helpful. Fear of revolution is very important when talking about governmental control. But moving up in the ranks, we have a general named Trevor Stone, who could give us insight on the censorship of the soldiers' newspapers. Mr. Stone, would you like to say a few words on the military's involvement on the newspapers that were provided to the soldiers?
Well, in the beginning of the war, we really didn't need to involve ourselves in the propaganda that was going out to the soldiers because we were doing really well. We were actively pushing back enemies on almost all of the fronts. It truly seemed like this would be a quick war for us. The problem is when the war started to drag on, the enemy had cut us off from any supplies coming from outside our front. The war was ending fast. So we started to censor and refocus the news that soldiers were getting. We changed numbers to make it seem like our losses were not so great and focused on the smallest of victories to give these soldiers hope. We would be overrun more quickly if the spirit of our men fell sooner.
But did you feel bad at all? This is basically lying to your troops.
You know, if we had won the war, it wouldn't have mattered if we lied or not. Those lies would have been overshadowed with the fact that we were victorious. It would have made our actions look really good, but honestly, win or lose, I believe it was necessary. We needed those soldiers to believe in us as well as themselves. I believe what we did made that more possible.
What about after the war? How do you feel about the propaganda that was created then?
Honestly, I feel like in a way that it was also necessary. If the government hadn't tried to scare the masses out of the premise of revolution, then Germany would have sunk even deeper than it already was. Also, what if there was an anti-Bolshevik scare and they took real power in Germany? Do you think that our country would have been in better hands than the Russians? I think it was crucial to make sure that any thought of a Bolshevik revolution was crushed, and this dark propaganda was the purpose to destroy it.
That was really powerful, and I agree with you on the account of a Bolshevik takeover. The government was right to stamp them out. Thank you again, Mr. Stone, for your time and your very useful insight on the military's decision-making process. Next with us is Carissa Burr, who not only lost her husband, but her smallest child as well during the war. Now, Miss Burr, I first would like to extend my condolences to your lost loved ones. But also, could you tell us how life was for you after the war ended?
Thanks, Jerry. Everything that was hardly kept together by the hope of German victory just collapsed, and along with that, everyone too. I had never seen struggle such as I had during this time. I remember all the chaos that was happening because of this struggle. I was lucky enough and was able to get food for my children after the war because I was friends with the farmer's wife. I made a deal with him to wash and fix all of their clothes in exchange for a rather small amount of food, but it was more than most got. I also remember other wives had to not only support their children, but also their husbands because they weren't able to work due to injury. There were a lot of riots and tension in the country, and the newspapers wrote terrible things about the rioters.
What kinds of terrible things are you talking about?
Well, everything from anarchists to criminals. People always thought if this kept up, there was bound to be a civil war, and I think that's what the newspapers were trying to stamp out. They were trying to scare people away from the idea of revolution by labeling anyone who came close to an enemy of the country.
Do you think the government was wrong for trying to keep order this way?
Well, the thing is that many people were more focused on trying to support their children than to revolt. We had already gone through one long war, and I don't think anyone wanted to start another one, even if there were massive riots and tensions that could lead up to one. But it did help at keeping people pacified through fear.
Thank you, Miss Burr, for your insight on this matter. Imagine the tension she just described. I also think that it played a major part in why propaganda took a major U-turn. But now that we've talked about people with insight on the feelings of the German people, let's turn our attention to Sarah Balser and Carrie Miller. These two ladies played a massive role in all of the propaganda that went out into the public, and the soldiers by explaining the emotion behind 4 different posters. 2 of the posters from during the war, and then 2 from after the war. First is this poster.
Thanks for having us, Jerry. This poster is just a way to get people to buy war bonds from the German government to support the war. It says, "Why a war alone? The time is tough, but victory is certain." With this, it's really easy to draw in potential supports because it requires no work but a small amount of money on their part, and it says their sacrifice would be returned with interest and to ensure the victory of this war. This is also useful because it isn't scaring anyone, just simply putting it out there for them.
And what about the emotion behind this poster?
This is a very powerful piece of propaganda. As you can see, the man has his arm around his wife and child with a sword in the other, protecting it from anything that might come. Along with that, these people are smiling, giving the feeling that this is a happy moment, as opposed to being something that needs to be done. The words on the poster are "War Bond, help the guardians of your happiness," which again gives the audience the choice of very little work is with interest paid, refund, and promise that the money will help the war. This also plays with the audience's emotions by saying that this money is also a direct guide of happiness of your family, which makes this case more powerful.
So that during the war, we were trying to make sure that the people knew that victory would be the link to happiness. But what does that say about this post-war poster?
So by the looks of this picture, you can already see the darkness behind it. The baby and the kid in the back are crying. The mother is looking in the pot, and you can see that there is very little food. The father is also weeping at the fact that he can't get food for his family. All around, everyone just looks starving and depressed. Then it says at the bottom, "Farmers, do your work. The city is starving," which is basically stating that any farmers who are on strike are the sole cause of everyone else going without food. The government is trying to guilt-trip the farmers into doing their work, vastly different from what the government was trying to portray before.
And what about the second post-war poster we have here?
Again, like the last piece, you can already see the darkness that is trying to scare the audience. This piece does this by portraying a wolf with bloody paws standing over a man drowning in blood. Even without the words, you can tell that the artist is trying to show that some enemy is going to end all of us if we allow them to. With the words, Bolshevism means to drown the world in blood, gives a very powerful message. This is one of the many posters that is used in anti-Bolshevism campaign. They use scary posters like this to show Bolsheviks as enemy things or men that just want to tear everything down, which is very effective with pieces like this.
Well, I think we can all see the difference between pre-war posters and the post-war posters, but could you guys explain to us why the government would want to produce such post-war posters?
Well, as you can see with the third piece about the farmers is that the German government was trying to use propaganda to discourage not only the farmers, but everyone from rioting and going on strikes. If the farmers aren't working, then more people will grow hungry, and the starving people will start rioting, which will lead to more strikes. This vicious cycle could and has led to a civil war before, something the country could not afford.
Okay, that explains a lot, but what about the anti-Bolshevik poster? How does that tie in?
Along with not being able to afford a civil war, another thing the government was afraid of was the Bolsheviks taking power. Because if they did, they could persuade a large group of people to revolt, which would mean the end of the German government and the start of Russian control. With Russian control, they believed that the country would be so much worse, and they just didn't want to give up their seat of power in Germany.
Thank you, ladies, for your thoughts on these forms of propaganda. And I would like to thank everyone we had here today for their information and their stories they provided. But what I'm getting from all of this is that post-war German propaganda turned to the dark side because they were afraid of revolution. Evidence of this is plastered in all of their posters, scary or depressive images coupled with phrases. Phrases that are commanding with the intent to intimidate rather than rally. They use propaganda to attack groups of people and hold them accountable for strikes that happen around the country. But can we blame the German government? Labor groups all around the country went on strike. Tensions grew deeper and deeper, and there was this huge problem of if the Bolsheviks could take power or not. Because if Bolshevism had grabbed power in Germany, they could have ensured a civil war. Germany was already a broken nation, and they couldn't afford a civil war. It would have taken away what little the people already had. So they did the only thing they could do. They scared the idea of revolution out of the minds of people, and one of their tools to do so was propaganda. And as we can see today, it worked.